Imagine it's the 14th of August, 1923. You are a 41-year-old schoolteacher living in Berlin, Germany. Your name is Heinrich. You have spent the last 2 decades doing everything right. You wake up at 6 in the morning, walk to school through the same cobblestone streets you have known since childhood. You teach mathematics and history to children who look up to you, and then walk home again. You have a wife named Marta. You have 2 daughters. You have a small but tidy apartment near Prenzlauer Berg. You are proud of it. You are respectable. You are educated. You are careful with money. For 20 years you have saved, not in great amounts, but steadily the way a responsible man does. You have a passbook savings account at the local bank. You have government bonds. Those are considered the safest thing a person can own. These bonds are backed by the full strength of the German state. You have some life insurance policies. You have done, in every sense of the phrase, exactly what you were told to do. Save. Be patient. Trust the system. And then one morning in August 1923, you go to buy a loaf of bread. And the price is 1 million marks. Not a figure of speech. 1 million marks for a loaf of bread. 3 weeks earlier, it had cost 200,000 marks. 3 weeks before that, it had cost 50,000. And the month before that, it had cost 4,000. The numbers are so large they have stopped feeling like numbers. They feel like noise. If you have ever looked at your bank account, at your savings, or at your paycheck, and wondered what it actually means, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory invented by academics in a quiet university office. It is a pattern that has repeated itself across a dozen different countries, across 100 different years. In every corner of the world, every time a specific set of conditions has come together, it has happened to proud, educated, careful people just like Heinrich, just like your grandparents, just like millions of people today who are doing everything right and still feeling like they are losing ground. And if this kind of historical clarity is useful to you, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will not miss what is coming next. Because here's what they never tell you about inflation. They tell you it is a number, a percentage, a statistic that economists argue about. They tell you it is a problem that central banks manage. This is managed with something called monetary policy, which is a fancy phrase for adjusting interest rates. They tell you it is temporary or transitory or under control or being watched carefully by the appropriate authorities. What they do not tell you is what inflation actually is at its core underneath all the technical language, what it actually does, who it helps, and who it destroys. That is what this video is about, and it will permanently change how you read the news. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. The word inflation gets used every day on television and in newspapers, but most people have never been told what it is. Not really. They have been told it means prices go up. That is true, but that is like saying a hurricane is just bad weather. It is technically accurate and completely insufficient. Here is the real definition of what you're seeing. Inflation is the process by which the purchasing power of money is reduced over time. Purchasing power, that just means how much you can actually buy with a given amount of money. When inflation is running at 10%, $100 of savings can only buy $90 worth of goods. You did not spend anything. You did not lose anything in a market crash. You just held the money. And it shrank, silently, without announcement. Now think about where money comes from. It does not grow in the ground. In modern economies, money is created primarily by central banks, like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, and by commercial banks when they issue loans. When there is more money chasing the same amount of goods, prices rise. This is the mechanism. Think of it like a pizza. If you have 8 slices of pizza and 8 people, everyone gets 1 slice. If you suddenly print 2 more people into the room but keep the pizza the same size, each person gets a little less. That is inflation. The pizza is the real economy. The people are units of money. More money, same goods. Every unit of money buys a little less. But here's the part that changes everything. Inflation is not just an economic inconvenience. It is a transfer mechanism. It moves wealth from one group to another. It takes from savers and gives to debtors. It takes from people who hold cash and gives to people who hold assets. And most devastatingly, it takes from citizens and gives to governments. Governments are almost always the largest debtors. When a government owes trillions of dollars and inflation runs at 10% a year, the real value of that debt is eroded. The debt shrinks in real terms, and the people who hold the currency bear the cost. Inflation is not an accident. It is a feature. This brings us directly to the story of Heinrich in Berlin and what happened in Germany. Between 1921 and 1923, it was one of the most instructive case studies in the history of money. After the First World War ended in 1918, Germany was broken. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crippling reparations. These were enormous payments Germany was required to make to the victorious Allied nations, especially France. The German government did not have the money to pay, so they did what governments have always done. They printed more money. The German central bank, the Reichsbank, began creating new currency at an accelerating pace. At first, the inflation was manageable. Between 1919 and 1921, prices rose, but not catastrophically. People adjusted. Then, in January 1923, France occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, after Germany fell behind on payments. German workers went on strike. The German government, to support them, printed even more money to pay those workers. This was the match that lit the fire. What followed is almost impossible to describe in rational terms. In January 1923, $1 could be exchanged for about 17,000 German marks. By November of that same year, less than 12 months later, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. 4,200 billion marks in a single year. Prices were doubling, then doubling again, sometimes within days. By the worst weeks of November 1923, prices were doubling approximately every 2 days. Heinrich's life savings, built over 20 years of careful, disciplined saving, were worth essentially nothing. His government bonds paid out their face value in marks, but those marks now could not buy a postage stamp. Life insurance policies, same story. Even his salary, when it came, was almost meaningless. Workers began receiving their wages twice a day so they could spend them immediately before the money lost value. Women would wait outside factories with wheelbarrows to collect their husband's pay and run to the shops. People burned banknotes for warmth because firewood cost more than the notes themselves. A visitor to Berlin described seeing patrons at a restaurant pay for their meal at the beginning of the sitting, because by the time dessert was served, the price would have changed. By November 1923, Heinrich had nothing, not because he had been foolish or reckless, but because he had trusted paper money and paper promises. He trusted a system that had quietly, systematically decided it needed to erase its debts. And the middle class of Germany, teachers, civil servants, pensioners, were the ones erased along with those debts. Think about your own savings. Not as a number, but as a question. What is that number actually backed by? What promise does it represent? Who made it? And what have they done with that promise in the past? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, what I am about to show you turns history into a pattern. This leads us to the second part of this story. Jump forward 80 years to a different continent, Argentina. What happened in Germany was not a German problem. It emerged again in December 2001 in Argentina. Argentina, in the 1990s, had pegged its currency, the peso, to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. This was called the convertibility plan. The idea was to stop inflation, which had ravaged the country. In the late 1980s, prices had risen by 3,000% in a single year. The peg worked for a while. Inflation stabilized. The economy grew. Middle-class Argentines began to feel prosperous again. They saved. They opened dollar-denominated bank accounts. They bought apartments. They trusted the system. But underneath the surface, the same rot was spreading. The government was spending more than it collected. It was borrowing heavily. The peso was overvalued, making exports uncompetitive. Debt was mounting. Economic shocks hit. A crisis in Brazil, a global slowdown, a drop in commodity prices. By 2001, Argentina was in a full recession. The government was running out of money, and people began to notice. In November 2001, Argentines began withdrawing their savings from banks. Slowly at first, then in a rush. The government, seeing a bank run developing, did something that left millions of people breathless with disbelief. On December 1st, 2001, the government announced the Corralito. This was a complete freeze on bank accounts. Argentines woke up on December 2nd and found they could not access their savings. The limit was 250 pesos a week. If you had 50,000 pesos saved, the government had effectively locked it away in a box the size of a stamp. In January 2002, Argentina ended the 1-to-1 peg. The peso collapsed to nearly 4 pesos per dollar. 100,000 pesos, once worth $100,000, were worth roughly $25,000. 3/4 of your savings had been erased by a policy decision made in an office while you slept. Argentina's GDP fell 20%. Unemployment rose. Poverty exploded. Supermarkets were looted. People banged pots in a protest known as cacerolazo. 5 presidents came and went in 2 weeks. The country descended into controlled chaos that rewrote the social contract between the state and its citizens. The people who got hurt the most were exactly the same class as Heinrich, the professional middle class. They lost everything, not because they were foolish, but because they had done exactly what the system asked. Now look at Zimbabwe in the late 90s. It was once one of Africa's most productive economies with fertile farmland. But in 2000, land redistribution caused agricultural production to collapse. Investment fled, revenue dried up. The government printed money to cover the gap. By 2007, annual inflation was past 66,000%. In 2008, inflation reached 2.2 million percent. Some estimated 79.6 billion percent annually. They issued the $100 trillion note. It could not buy bread. It was worth less than the paper. Gideon Gano described it as surgery during an earthquake. But the earthquake had been caused by the surgery. Ordinary Zimbabweans experienced something that broke their sense of reality. A farmer named Samuel, living outside Harare, described walking to the market each morning and seeing the prices chalked on the board change 3 times before he had finished shopping. Nurses, teachers, civil servants, the backbone of any functioning society, watched their salaries become meaningless within days of being paid. The formal economy essentially ceased to function. People returned to barter. They used foreign currencies, US dollars, South African rand, as unofficial money long before the government acknowledged the reality of what had happened. Venezuela, beginning around 2016, followed the same arc. Inflation hit 800% in 2016. It crossed 4,000% in 2017. By 2018, estimates put it at approximately 1.7 million percent. The same pattern. A government facing fiscal pressure, a decision to print money, a currency collapsing, and ordinary people, the teachers, the nurses, the small shop owners, the pensioners, finding that their life's savings had been reduced to a number that required scientific notation to write. Most people will never know what you now know at this point in this video. Most people will see these stories as exotic disasters from faraway places, Germany in the past, Africa, South America, and tell themselves that these things cannot happen where they live to people like them. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not fully understand, keep leaving their savings in the same account year after year, keep believing that the number on the screen is real and stable and protected. If you are still here, you are not most people. What I am about to show you next is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Hit subscribe, because the next section is going to change how you look at money for the rest of your life. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Germany 1923, Argentina 2001, Zimbabwe 2008, Venezuela 2016, Lebanon 2019, where GDP fell from $55 billion to $23 billion in just 3 years, and inflation eventually surpassed even Zimbabwe's rate. Every single one of these cases followed the same sequence. Not approximately the same, exactly the same. Step 1. A government accumulates debt it cannot repay through normal means. Step 2. Rather than accept the painful political consequences of spending cuts or honest default, it chooses a third path, inflation. It creates money directly or through the banking system to cover the gap. Step 3. At first, prices rise slowly. The official numbers say it is manageable. Leaders use calm, technical language. They talk about monetary policy tools and appropriate adjustments. People adjust. Step 4. Expectations shift. This is the critical moment. Once ordinary people start to believe that prices will keep rising, they change their behavior. Workers demand higher wages. Businesses raise prices preemptively. Landlords raise rents. Everyone is trying to get ahead of the next wave. And this behavior, rational for each individual, makes the wave larger for everyone. Step 5. The process accelerates beyond the government's control. The solution they reach for, printing more money, only feeds the fire they are trying to put out. Step 6. The currency collapses, or the savings are frozen, or the accounts are confiscated, and the damage is done. The mechanism is the same. Different countries, different decades, different governments, same result. Inflation is not a thermometer reading. It is a process that always has victims and always has beneficiaries. And the identity of both is nearly always the same. Collapse is not a fire. It is a river changing course. By the time most people realize it, the banks are already on the new shore. This brings us directly to what is perhaps the most important question in this entire video. Who actually pays, and who walks away fine? Let us be precise about this. The victims of inflation almost always share the same profile. They are people who hold their wealth in cash or in cash-like instruments, savings accounts, government bonds, fixed income products like certificates of deposit. These are people who were told, explicitly or implicitly, that holding cash was safe, that saving was responsible, that government bonds were the safest investment a person could make because they were backed by the full faith of the state. In Germany in 1923, the middle class had invested heavily in war bonds during World War I, government bonds, as a patriotic act. They were told these were safe. They lost everything. In Argentina in 2001, the middle class had trusted their peso savings accounts and their dollar-denominated accounts. They lost most of it. In Lebanon, starting in 2019, hundreds of thousands of ordinary Lebanese citizens had their life savings frozen in banks that could no longer honor withdrawal requests. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value against the dollar over just 2 years. Doctors, engineers, professors, people who had spent decades building financial security found themselves unable to afford groceries. And then there are the people who came through, the people who owned land before the crisis hit. In Weimar Germany, farmers and landowners were in a fundamentally different position than urban savers. Their land did not become worthless. Their grain and livestock held real value even as the currency disintegrated. A farmer who had borrowed money to buy land before the hyperinflation found that by the time the crisis peaked, his debt had inflated away to almost nothing. He effectively got his land for free, paid for by the savers who had lent him money. People who held foreign currency, or who had accounts in Swiss banks or London banks, the wealthier and more internationally connected members of society, were able to preserve their wealth by stepping out of the collapsing currency and into a stable one. This was legal and available to them. It was not available to most ordinary people who either did not know to do it, did not have the connections to do it, or did not believe it would become necessary until it was too late. Business owners who owned real, physical things, machinery, inventory, property, were in a better position than those who owned paper. The value of the paper could go to zero overnight. The value of the machinery did not. During Argentina's 2001 crisis, people who owned rental properties found that while the nominal value of their peso savings had been gutted, physical real estate retained meaning as an asset. It could be sold. It could be lived in. It was something real in a world where the paper was being revealed as nothing. And the most counterintuitive fact of all, the biggest single beneficiary of inflation, in almost every case in history, is the government itself, because governments are the largest borrowers. When a government has a national debt of $1 trillion and annual inflation runs at 10% for a decade, the real value of that debt has been slashed in half through inflation alone, without ever officially defaulting or restructuring. The bondholders and savers and pensioners who were owed that money are simply handed back less in real terms than they were promised. No legislation needed, no formal announcement. It happens in the background, while prices on the shelf quietly rise. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that question. The question is not whether governments will face the temptation of the inflation route when debts become unmanageable. They always have, and they always will. The only real question, the one that determines whether you stand among the victims or the survivors, is whether you see the mechanism clearly enough and early enough to understand which side of this transfer you are on. If this channel helps you think differently about the systems that shape your financial life, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might be worth more than you expect. Because the next section is the hardest one to hear. Let us now look at what the historical record shows about the people who came through these events with their financial lives intact. And I want to be very clear before I say any of this, this is not financial advice. Every situation is individual. Consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. What follows is pattern recognition drawn from the historical record. That is all it is. But it is pattern recognition that is remarkably consistent across all the cases we have examined. The historical record shows that those who came through periods of severe inflation largely shared three broad characteristics. The first is that they owned something real before the crisis began. Not paper claims on something real, not a savings account that promised to give them money that could buy real things. They owned the real things directly: land, a building, a working business with physical assets, a productive farm, a house they lived in. The nature of the asset varied, but the principle was the same. Something that existed in the physical world. Something whose value was not entirely dependent on the continued promises of a government or a bank. In every one of the case studies we have looked at, the people who owned productive physical assets before the collapse moved through it in a fundamentally different way than those who owned only paper. The second characteristic is that they understood what the numbers were telling them before the majority of people did. This sounds elusive, but in hindsight it is remarkably consistent. In the years before Germany's hyperinflation peaked in 1923, there were economists and business people who understood that the trajectory of money printing was unsustainable. Some of them moved assets abroad, converted savings into foreign currency, or bought property. The people who waited until the crisis was obvious, until the wheelbarrows and the burning banknotes made it undeniable, were already too late. The transfer had already happened. By the time the general public understood what was happening, the window for most responses had already closed. The third characteristic is that they maintained low debt in foreign currency, but were not afraid of debt in the local currency. This is one of the most counterintuitive observations in the historical record. A mortgage in local currency, or a business loan in local currency, can be inflated away along with everything else. The person who borrowed 50,000 pesos before Argentina's devaluation and used that money to buy a physical asset found that by 2002, their debt was worth a fraction of what it had been in real terms, while the physical asset largely held its value. The debt was erased by inflation. The asset remained. By contrast, anyone who had borrowed in dollars found that when the peso collapsed, their dollar debt suddenly required 4 times as many pesos to service. This was catastrophic for many Argentine businesses and individuals who had taken out dollar-denominated loans. None of this is a formula. History does not hand out formulas. But across 5 continents and a century of case studies, the same broad patterns appear with enough consistency that ignoring them requires a deliberate choice. Let us come back now to Heinrich, the schoolteacher from Berlin, the man who did everything right. By the end of 1923, his savings, his bonds, his insurance policies had been reduced to a value that was, for all practical purposes, nothing. He was 51 years old. He had daughters to support. His dignity had not changed. His character had not changed. His work ethic had not changed. But the rules of the system he had trusted his entire adult life had been changed around him, and the change had taken everything paper he owned. Germany eventually stabilized. In November 1923, a new currency was introduced called the Rentenmark. The hyperinflation was stopped, though the damage was permanent for millions of people like Heinrich. The savings were gone. The bonds were gone. Years of careful, responsible behavior had been translated into nothing. And perhaps the most devastating part of the story is that no one was ever held accountable. No one went to prison. No law was broken. The government had simply made decisions about its own debt, and the middle class had paid the price. This is the truth about inflation that they do not put in the headline. Not the percentage, not the number. The mechanism, the direction of the flow, the identity of the payer, and the identity of the recipient. Inflation is not chaos. It is not random. It has a logic. And that logic runs in a consistent direction, across countries, across centuries, across governments of every political stripe. The direction runs away from the patient saver and toward the indebted state, away from the man with the passbook and toward the person who owns the land the passbook is buried under. Understanding this is not cynicism, it is literacy, the financial kind, the kind that separates the people who look back at these events as distant tragedies from the people who, because they understood the mechanism, were standing on the right side of the transfer when it happened. Heinrich was not stupid. He was not unlucky. He was not warned. That is the real tragedy. And that is why this history matters. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. The case studies discussed in this video represent specific historical circumstances that may not reflect your own. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making any financial decision about your own circumstances. This video is not for everyone. Most people who encounter this kind of history will nod along and then return to doing exactly what they were doing before. That is human nature. But if one person in your life, a parent nearing retirement, a sibling just starting to save, a friend who has never thought about what money actually is, needs to hear what Heinrich's story really means, share this video with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more historical analysis, and I will see you in the next one.